50 days ago was the day of the wave sheath offering. We talked about this during the days of unleavened bread. And it was a time, just as a reminder, it was a time when ancient Israel would go and harvest the first of the barley harvest and wave a sheath in front of the Lord to be accepted by him. We can read about this in Leviticus 23:10, where it says, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land which I give you, and reap its harvest, then you shall bring a sheaf of the firstfruits of your harvest to the priest. He shall wave the sheaf before the Lord to be accepted on your behalf on the day after the Sabbath. The priest shall wave it." Right, and so we talked about how this wave sheath offering pictured Christ going up to the Father. And then we can drop down just a few verses and see how God linked this wave sheath offering to today, this day of Pentecost. So in Leviticus 23:15 it says, "And you shall count for yourselves from the day after the Sabbath, from the day that you brought the sheath of the wave offering, 7 Sabbaths shall be completed. Count 50 days to the day after the 7th Sabbath. Then you shall offer a new grain offering to the Lord. You shall bring from your dwellings 2 wave loaves of 2/10 of an ephah. They shall be of fine flour. They shall be baked with leaven. They are the firstfruits to the Lord." Right, so we see here in these verses that not only is the day of Pentecost linked to this wave sheath offering because that's how we know the day to celebrate the day of Pentecost, but both of the offerings, both of these grain offerings, both the wave sheath offering and the 2 loaves of bread are called first fruits, right? So they're both first fruits to the Lord. Very similar terminology was used in both of these. And we can read in a number of other places, and I won't go into them, but I'll at least give them as reference. So this Exodus 23:16, Exodus 34:22, and Numbers 28:26, where this day of Pentecost, where God gave some commandments about the day of Pentecost, they're all tied to this notion of a first fruit of a harvest, right? And specifically for the day of Pentecost, it was tied to a first fruit of the wheat harvest, right? And this term first fruit can imply quite a bit. Today, we don't think about it as much as they would have in the days of Christ or in the days of ancient Israel, where they were very much tied to an agricultural cycle, right? So until that first fruit came, they would have no new food to eat that year. So this was, the beginning of a new food cycle. And when it didn't happen, it could be quite devastating, right? So we know about, let's say, the example of Joseph, the 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of lean, where those 7 years of lean, they wouldn't have had as big of first fruits. They would have known that they were going to be very short of food, right? So you can imagine, think back to after those 7 lean years, the year after that, how they would have felt during that first fruit, where it was a much more abundant harvest than they'd seen 7 years before. So in our society, where we get constant amount of food, and we've evolved to the ways in farming and those kind of things where we can get a continuous cycle of food, this notion of first fruit doesn't have as much meaning. But we know during this time of Christ or during ancient Israel, this first fruit time was a period of joy, was a period of thankfulness to God that what was to come, that harvest that was to come. And we know that the apostles use this notion of first fruits in a number of ways, and I want to look through a couple of those today. So the first one is, the Apostle Paul tied this notion of first fruits, in particular the wave sheath offering, to the resurrection of Christ. And we'll just read a couple of scriptures here. We can read in 1 Corinthians 15:20. It says, "But now Christ is risen from the dead and has become the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep." And then it goes on in verse 23 where it talks about, but in each one in his own order, Christ the first fruits, so Christ being that wave sheath offering that came at the very first, at the beginning of the days of unleavened bread, and then afterwards, those who are Christ at his coming, right? So we know that's pictured by this day of Pentecost, this time where there's a fuller harvest. And other apostles use the same terminology or the same metaphor. So James uses this term first fruits to apply to those who are brethren in the faith. And we'll just read in James 1:18. It says, "Of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of his creation, of his creatures." So we see James is calling those brethren who are in the faith first fruits of God's creatures. And then John also uses this idea in the book of Revelation, where it says in Revelation 14:4, "There are the ones who are not defiled with women, for they are virgins. These are the ones who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. These are redeemed from among men, being firstfruits to God and to the Lamb." So again, he's calling those people of faith, the people that believe in God, that are following God in his ways, they're firstfruits. They're firstfruits to God. So using the same terminology that was used in the Old Testament and talked about as the customs of the days of Pentecost and the wave sheaf offering. So we see that the apostles used this spring harvest, which would have had so much meaning to the people of that day, to picture what God is doing on this day, founding his church, a harvest of spiritual firstfruits that has not yet fully taken place, right? We're still in the middle of that harvest. And Paul goes on and uses this in another way, which I think is very interesting, another place where he talks about this that's also very much tied to what happened on this day of Pentecost. So he gives this notion that the Spirit that he gave on the day of Pentecost was just a portion of what he's going to give us in the end time when we're actually fully redeemed. And we can read this in Romans. So if you turn to Romans 8:18, it says, "For I consider that the suffering of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed to us," right? So much like Mr. Holliday talked last week about how much suffering there is at this time, Paul is telling us that we should expect this, that he went through a lot of this, a lot of these sufferings, and he's telling us to look forward, that these sufferings are not to be compared to what is to come. And then it goes on, it says, "For the earnest expectation of the creation eagerly waits for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subject to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope. Because the creation itself also will be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and labors with birth pains together until now." And then in verse 23, we see he makes this connection. "Not only that, but we also who have the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, eagerly waiting for the adoption, the redemption of our body." Right? And this should give us great hope. So we know, as Mr. Parman pointed out, this great rushing wind, the power that he gave on that first day of Pentecost, it's but a first fruit of the Spirit for us. It's just the beginning of what God is going to give us. We often talk about it as a down payment. And it's the same notion, right? The first fruit, when you go and harvest this wheat or barley harvest, it's just the beginning of the harvest that you're going to get. And so that is what Paul is telling us here, is that Spirit that God poured out, as mighty and as powerful as it seemed, it was just a beginning. It was just the first of the Spirit that he's going to give us, right? And as Mr. Eddington pointed out yesterday, we can think about what this power did in the apostles, right? It turned them from uneducated men who abandoned Christ at the time that he was being crucified to mighty preachers of the truth who weren't silenced by the same religious authorities that they had ran away from just 50 days before, right? Even after threats and beatings and things like this, they used that first fruit of the Spirit to do these mighty things. And so as we think about, what we have today, what God gives us at baptism, it's just a small part of what he's going to give us when we're fully redeemed, when our bodies are redeemed and we're resurrected into Christ. And he goes on in Romans and tells us, that even though it's just this first fruit, that the Spirit does more than what we even understand it does. And so in Romans 8:24, it goes on, "For we were saved in this hope, but hope that is seen is not hope. For why does one still hope for what he sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, we eagerly wait for it with perseverance." And then in verse 26, it says, "Likewise, the Spirit also helps in our weakness. For we do not know what we should pray for as we ought, but the Spirit himself makes intercessions for us with groanings which cannot be uttered." So we see this first fruit of the Spirit, it works in us, and it works in ways that we don't understand, right? We can pray something that either we don't really need, or we can need something that we don't know that we need, but the Spirit is there seeing, being part of us and understanding what we need, and is making intercessions for us directly with God, right? So it's amazing what this power is, but as we think about it, it's only a small part of what God is to give us when we are redeemed. And so it goes on, it says, now he who searches the heart knows that the mind of the Spirit knows what the mind of the Spirit is, because he makes intercession for the saint according to the will of God. And we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. For whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. So again, this notion of firstborn, that this, first fruit of the Spirit is helping us be among the firstborn of his brethren. But that it doesn't stop with us, right? It doesn't stop with this spring harvest. We know it goes on to a greater harvest, a bigger harvest that we picture during the fall holy days. So, as we think about it, brethren, this day is a day of first fruit. And yes, it's also, it's a day that it pictures the beginning of the church, beginning of the first fruits of God's family, right? That it's not fully come because we've not been resurrected to his family, but much like it's the beginning of the church, it's also for us personally the beginning of the Spirit working within us, right? It's this small portion of the Spirit that God will give us when we're resurrected as a down payment for what's to come. So let us thank God, right, that he's given us this day of Pentecost, an annual reminder of these things that are to come, and what part that he's allowing us to play in his plan of salvation, right? Not just for us, but also for all of mankind, that his Spirit is working with us, working within us, so that we can be among the firstborn of his brethren.